got that?
No, I didn't. I accidentally hit the home button right when I said that.
Oh, why did you do that?
Right when you said that.
Well,
If you ever knew her, you would understand immediately.
so you can create any. What is that called? What is that called when you make up a word or make up sentences that match the letters? Isn't there a word for that?
I thought it was an I don't know.
Is that Ebonics?
That is not Ebonics. This is evidence. Acronym, I think.
Anagram is what I was thinking.
Anagram.
What we really
An
mean
acronym
is
is the letters themselves.
Welcome
Like-
back,
Yeah, I need to get a
Did
shot.
you get the note about Ebonics?
Yeah, I got that one.
Oh, okay.
Oh my gosh.
All right.
Please upload it tonight.
Well, and I made a terrible mistake once. When I was teaching in Burlington back in the 70s, I had a junior high class that, it was a junior high choir class, and I was trying to teach them to read music, and so I challenged them to write something that was more pertinent than "Every good bird does fly," and probably shouldn't challenge middle school kids to come up with words that start with F. So I didn't actually get any of those that made any sense. But for right now, we're talking about the treble clef. And there are some, and I forgot to tell you that the spaces spell...
I learned a rhyme from Mr. Atchison and Woodrow, and it annoyed me so much that I never forgot it.
Well, and that's oftentimes the best way to remember.
And that was before I knew what a treble clef was. So,
Can we hear it?
E, G, B, D, F. Those are the lines of the treble clef. F, A, C, E. Just spell face to name each space. And I hated it because there was a rug, and the rug was like the treble clef, and every time he said a note, he had to jump to that part on the rug. So it was like a really funky twister. And then he got to F, and it was just a cluster.
Well,
No one knew where to go.
sounds just like it. But anyway, the two things. There are spots that have to be put in Now, beyond those notes, the note that sits on the top, Humpty Dumpty, is a G. The note that hangs underneath is a D. And then we start to tack on or build on extra staff. And all of you have seen ledger lines, either above or below. Some of you both above and below.
Mm-hmm.
But ledger lines, by the way, when you're constructing them, the best thing to do is to make sure that the ledger line space is the same size as the rest of the space of that paper. In other words, about right there. And then, of course, you've got some anything to stick out. You can tell that I actually missed that just a little bit. But here's something that people do when they write music by hand that really can foul things up.
That's so annoying.
Yeah, it does not look at all like that line goes up. This is a higher note than this, and this is a higher note yet than that, but it looks like they're all the same pitch, and it gets very frustrating. And this was the point I was making the other day when I forgot to finish. God, can you imagine me forgetting to finish a thought? Day.
Uh-oh.
But, the thing I was telling you about is you want to write rhythmically so that it looks the way it should sound. In other words, don't compact it so that you have a very small space for a whole note, which really does get a lot of sound, so you need to give it a lot of paper. And also the same thing with that. Make sure it looks like if one note is higher than another, it's going up to sound like it's higher than another. Because here's what happens when you hand out music to your for your friends, maybe an orchestra or a band after you have written something, and you have them sight read it. If you have created some strange looking things like whole note, quarter, half note, in no particular spacing, they'll mess that up because they depend on the spacing to help them with it. And if you do the thing I did up there, I won't redo it again, but make it difficult to tell what pitch is for which note. The problem that happens, and this is just human nature, and this is why I think all humans should actually be killed off and started over from a different seed or something. But in human nature, they will not say to you, "That's hard for me to read," or "I misread it because it was written wrong." What they'll say is, "Your music sucks." And that hurts your feelings really bad. And they get to where they don't want to read anything you wrote anymore, and they don't realize that it's just that they didn't read it right. But what you want to do is make it as easy as possible for them to read it correctly so they can say, "Oh, that sounded pretty good." And what they're really saying is, "I did well on this. I read it well." They're never going to compliment you, by the way. But
just hand it back and have them say, "You play it how you want it to sound." And
there you go. So that's the reason why we want to make sure that we give them every possibility of understanding our music the first time through so that they don't just say, "Your music sucks." All right, so obviously this is an A, B, C, D. Now, the thing about your ledger lines is at some point, if you're going to have lots and lots of ledger lines, there are other ways of getting out of that. For instance, if you're going to write a first violin part that is just constantly above the staff, it's you might consider the 8VA thing and write it in the staff, okay? However, a lot of that is going by the wayside. Trombones, as a matter of fact, are the ones that are probably taking the heat on this. If you would take a look at Philip's folder in his jazz folder, almost everything that Philip plays is a ledger line. Now there is a tenor clef, and trombones used to all learn how to play treble clef or tenor clef, and that's again a movable clef. We will actually get to tenor clef later on, and I'm just making this as an example now. But trombones used to always have to read tenor clef because that kept the notes in the staff more. Nowadays, it's really rare to find a composer that will challenge the trombones by doing that. Instead, they just write all notes on ledger lines. And it gets sometimes really difficult to read, especially if they get it too close together. I don't know whether, and you don't run into it as much when it's done on a computer, but a lot of jazz music is handwritten. And if you start writing something for Philip like this, sometimes they end up connecting almost, or your eye actually connects them, and pretty soon you're seeing yet another staff up there. And would be a lot easier if they would perhaps write it in tenor. And Philip could read it in tenor, so they should do it that way. But that's their determination now, that they want the trombones just to learn to read lots of ledger lines. Such a sad thing. Now, when you're drawing note heads, by the way, they are not they are not baseballs. They are footballs. Yes.
How do you draw tenor clef, just for giggles?
Okay. It's kind of like a fancy E. There's two lines that end on the second line. Then it's kind of like that.
Okay.
Okay? And it looks just like the alto clef, which is
So I was about to ask that too.
looks just exactly like the tenor clef, except the alto clef lands on the bottom line. This is the only clef that actually makes sense, by the way. And we're going to learn it later, but I'm just going to tell you now. There's not as much sense of any other clef. For instance, in treble clef, they call this middle C. And what's middle about that? In bass clef, which is also known as the F clef, they call that a middle C. And again, what's middle about that? But in the alto clef, wherever the notch of the alto clef is, that is middle C. So it just so happens in alto clef, middle C happens to be dead center. And in middle C for tenor is that one there. At least it's inside the staff. Now there is actually some good reason why we call this middle C. We have to talk about the grand staff before we can actually relate that. But it always is fun to make that point. All right, now at the bottom of page 9 there are note heads. They are not perfectly round circles, by the way. They are actually kind of a football, but the football is not laying flat on the turf. It's tilted up this way, all right? Kind of like this. And I didn't do a very good job of that, but I was close. But when you draw a whole note, you want to make sure that it touches the top line and it touches the bottom line. You see I miss on that one. There's a little bit of a line left over, but it does not go above, all right? And when you draw one on a line, you want to try to have as much of the note above that line as it is below that line, and you want to have at least half of the space left over. There's nothing worse than to have a whole note that's kind of like that, because that could actually be any of 3 notes. Okay? So you have to be very particular about that. All right, let's see how we're doing here. Let's turn the page to page 10, please. And then there again, they're going to ask you to practice. I don't care if you practice. If you practice, you may. Do it right there on your page 10. But I probably won't look at it, so if you don't want to practice, you don't have to. Is in the little gray box below there.
Uh-oh.
We'll do a little ear straining. It starts out very